Welcome to KIMEcast, where we break through and cut the BS in sports medicine, rehabilitation, and sports performance, and talk about how things really work.
Welcome back to KIMEcast. Tony Mikla, Russ Dunning. So we're just having a great case conversation around the concept of stretching, and I think this idea of stretching is obviously really big out there. Like we were talking about how many people we come into contact with through patients or, working with teams and being like a coach of a team, and people, hey, should my kids stretch more? Should I stretch more? I need to work my flexibility, these types of things, which are all great. And let's kind of dive into like maybe when and why and why some of these cases are out there. And the first thing to think about comes down to probably what does it mean to stretch? And then why are you doing it? Right. So there's a real clear question as to like, why are you stretching? Like people think, it's to increase my mobility and I increase my range of motion. And what we would challenge, the very first thought you have to challenge here on this idea is, are you being limited in the range of motion due to actual tissue tightness that requires it to be stretched? And the crazy thing here is that the majority of the time, the answer is probably no. Mm-hmm. And that might be really hard for people to think. So just for example, you could do this. You could stand up, try to touch your toes, and you'll be like, all the dudes would be like, well, I can't do that.
And I haven't been able to do that in 20 years.
Right. Yeah. And I would say you're right. Right. And then of course, most of the females would be like, well, I can do it. Maybe it's easier. Maybe it's hard. Maybe you're sitting for a while today and it's not as easy as it usually is, whatever it is. And you would all say, well, why can't you touch your toes? And most people would say, well, it's because my hamstrings are tight.
Because that's where I feel it.
Yes, because I feel my hamstrings, and they seem to be tight.
Since I feel it there, the tightness must be there.
Yeah, and then I must stretch that, obviously, and once I do, I would get better. And if you believed that, then you would probably stretch for 5 or 6 days, and then, for 30 seconds, if you will, and then your toe touch should improve. Mm-hmm. But does it? Is the question. And the answer to that is most likely not. Mm-hmm. In some cases, yes. You might have, 10, 20% of the time people do some stretching and, I can touch the ground better. I did it for the last minute or two. I warmed up. I got some stretches and I feel better. Or maybe you did that for 4 or 5 days in a row and it got better. But the reality is for a majority of the people is that the reason why you can't touch your toes or whatever else the flexibility need is that you have is because you probably lack the control to allow your body to relax enough so that the tension is decreased in the hamstring.
That's it. Because, if you're tight, that's a big if you're tight in a certain spot, which you probably don't know because it doesn't tell you. That's the other kind of key thing is how we sense our body. Oftentimes the tight spot is not actually the one barking at you. The one barking at you is the one that's being overused, that's overstressed. So if you are tight in a particular area of your body, the next question is why? And if it's a lack of control, which is a lack of coordination, which you can kind of think is a lack of strength, maybe it's, light strength in a long position. We kind of call that a lot of words. Well, we call that coordination. And if you don't have great coordination with that length, then your body has a mistrust. Why would it trust a body that it can't control? Oh, I'll just hold on to some tension in that area. And by the way, I'm not going to tell anyone about it. I'm just going to hold on to tension, and I'm not going to let the brain know. That's how kind of crazy I think our body is it has the ability of holding on to some tone in a particular area of the body, and the brain has no idea because it's a local tone that's not guided by me saying, I feel like I'm going to have a tight back today. No,
yeah,
I don't think that.
Absolutely. Back to the example, what we're saying here is that if you were to try to touch your toes and you're not able to touch your toes or whatever distance you're going, you feel this tension probably in your hamstrings for the most part. What we're saying is that the reason why the hamstring is tight is because it's holding on to a responsibility to stabilize your pelvis, basically. So because it feels tight because it's contracted. And the way to get it to stop being contracted and to actually relax is that you have to give stability to your pelvis or to your lumbar spine most likely. And if the stability was there, your body would then let go of the hamstrings because it would be safe to do so. And then all of a sudden, voila, the motion would be easier for you. And we can demonstrate this a number of ways. How this has to do with, like Russ is saying, your nervous system tone. There's many, many tricks that we would call these that you can improve right away. And if any of these tricks work for you, then stretching is probably not your solution, but rather motor control would be. So, for example, there's a trick where if you took a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball, take your shoes off and just take the ball and put it on the plantar surface of your foot, on the bottom of your foot, just roll on the ball and just don't necessarily roll it vigorously back and forth, but roll it back and forth and then find a sensitive spot in the bottom of your foot. Just hold that pressure for like a minute. For like a long minute, take your time, take a few breaths. You could do the other foot after you do that one for a minute and then try to touch your toes again and see if it's different. If you improved, stretching is probably not your problem. Neuromuscular tone is your problem. And what you did by using that ball is you decreased the tone in your muscles, and now you're able to actually move a little bit further because you got the muscle to relax first. Mm-hmm. So that's option one. There's many of these. You could do 10 speed squats. So you could just do 10 times quick squat, body weight up and down, 10 times relatively fast, boom, 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 and then retest. Mm-hmm. When you do that, you activate a number of muscles in the body. Certainly your core will be one of them, probably your feet and many other things as well. But now when you go to touch your toes, the rest of the body is active, so you have some control. You've turned things on, and then you could try the toe touch, and a lot of times you'll see that you'll make gains there as well. Mm-hmm. So again, you didn't stretch the hamstrings at all, but yet you improved your range of motion because you provided stability maybe in the core or somewhere else in the body. Gray Cook's got a great one. It's toe touch progressions, really common, where you stand with your feet together, you put a couple of pillows between your knees, you squeeze your knees together really tight into the pillows as you reach down for your toes, and you make a really active squeeze contraction as you actively reach for the floor. Do that 10 times in a row. Squeeze and reach, come back up, squeeze and reach, come back up. Do 10 of those, then take the pillows out, try to touch your toes, and see what you've got. Now, you could argue that's kind of stretching as you do it because you go through the motion, but when you're squeezing, the squeeze of the adductors has a very strong synergistic contraction to the abdominals. So when you squeeze your adductors tight, your core stabilizes, your core line stabilizes. So the deep stabilizers of the spine kick in and turn on. And when that happens, it naturally inhibits the hamstrings from having to be on. So they start to relax again, and usually you can gain range. Yeah. So those are 3 tricks neuromuscularly to gain range of motion quickly. And if they work for you, then you probably don't have a tissue length problem, and stretching is not actually your long-term solution. It might feel great in the moment, which is why people love being stretched, because it feels good in the moment. It feels like you're attacking the issue. But then if you're like me, 3 minutes later, you're right back where you started.
Yeah. Well, I think that comes back to the why. You know, if any tension in your body is restricting you from moving in a certain way, you are more likely to have a certain pain pattern. You're more likely to injure your back. You're more likely to have some bicep tendonitis. The list goes on. If you have dysfunctional tensions, and then the question would be, why do you have these dysfunctional tensions? You know, I kind of look at it like it's either an internal or an external scar from trauma. You know, an event happened. You fell, so you twisted and you hurt something, some kind of tissue gave way, and that will always have an internal scar that will create this natural tightness post injury. So you can have that, which we call an injury. You can also have like postural tone. So we're designed to be moving throughout the day, and not everyone has jobs that allow them to move throughout the day. Many of us have to be in a car for a while. Some of us have to be at our computer for a while. Some of us have to stand in a particular way and do something with our hands for a particular while. So a lot of us have certain postures that we assume chronically over and over and over again. And that chronic posture, that's not fluid and dynamic. It's not like we're all just dancing throughout the day. So because of that, I think we can also get some funky tones in our body. So either have trauma or some chronic posturing issues. And if you say, I think stretching can benefit me, if you're thinking that you're that person, then perhaps you have a chronic posturing problem, or perhaps you have an old injury, an old internal wound that has created some tension. And then we need to say, like, okay, I want to fill the bucket in the movement mobility zone. So let's fill that bucket. How much motion do I need? Let's get that motion. And sometimes slow tension stretching, a long hold, a forced stretch, an overpressure stretch, and definitely coupled with a coordination exercise can give you a moment where you say, oh, my arm moves better. I can now rotate. all the way to the left. And, sometimes we could do more like low threat traditional stretches where you will get some local motion in the moment. And you can do higher threat things. Those would be kind of like dynamic movements. And where we kind of steer more toward a little bit higher threat at the right time is the dynamic motions help you learn. You learn how to then control that movement, whether you're in a kneeling position or a standing position or a lunge position. When you put enough threat to the body that you're forcing your body to learn how to control that, that's the secret. Yeah. Now it goes from like passive stretching to kind of like dynamic, active, controlling your body in a long position. And if the better you can lean in that way, now your body's learning a lesson, and that lesson has a chance of sticking to tomorrow. If you don't ever learn that lesson of how to control the length, well, plan on that tension coming right back the next morning.
Yeah, saw it, lived it my whole life. It would change my life when I went to Athletes Performance for my internship back in like 2004 when I was finishing PT school. Dynamic stretching was the big thing. Dynamic warm-up was like the big thing, and we had a very specific routine we went through. And as doing that as an intern, I was like, what was I, like 24, 25 at the time. It was tremendous because I'd spent my entire athletic career, like in practice in high school, every day. I mean, I'd play basketball every day, and every practice, every time we'd start with team stretching. We'd spend 10 minutes, like toe touching and lunging side to side, and like doing all the things where you hold and count to 30 seconds, and the next one, and you go together and you go through these things. And then when I went to Arizona and we did it in basketball, like we'd actually warm up, like we'd do some dribbling drills and some ball handling things for like 5 minutes. So that was kind of smart. And then the team would gather around center court and then again, spend 8 to 10 minutes stretching. And we did this forever. And my hamstrings, I couldn't touch the ground then. And then after I'd stretch, I was no better for 10 years. I mean, I was like, what? Like, this is a waste of my time. Like, as just looking at the result, I'm like, well, this is a complete waste of my time. And then when I got to AP and we started doing it as part of our routine, I was like, wow, like I'm actually like improving. Like I couldn't touch my toes and now I can. And then what I'm doing less of is actually stretching, but I'm doing exactly what you said. We did a lateral lunge and then we'd have to gain more motion as we went with each repetition. We would, instead of doing a hamstring stretch, we were doing like a hand walk, walking out, walking back, and doing like an inchworm. Everybody calls that an inchworm. And that's a dynamic way to stretch the hamstrings. You would say, but what you're doing, to your point, is you're activating other tissues and you're developing control in the body. And when you do that, you're earning new range of motion to work in. And as you accomplish that, then all of a sudden you have more mobility. So, yeah, that was life changing for me. It was it's interesting as well. And now everybody does it. At that time, Verstegen wrote his thesis statement as a strength coach on dynamic warm up. And now it's become common use that doing a dynamic warm-up before activity is better for the athlete. There's been strong evidence to suggest that, you can run faster, jump higher. Your nervous system is more actively wired. It's more ready to go by doing a more proper dynamic warm-up, which brings in the conversation around static stretching. Is it even good anymore? And should it be utilized at all? And I think it goes back to what's the tissue we're dealing with, right? Do you have to do it? But definitely what we know is static stretching prior to exercise does decrease muscle activation. So it does slow the person down. So if you want to, run fast in your sport or you want to jump high, you want to perform at a high level, then I wouldn't recommend you stretch before the activity. So it's certainly been proven that stretching within 2 hours of the activity does diminish your performance for, several hours. So that's something to consider. But doing it after the activity makes a ton of sense. So during any kind of activity, whether it be a weightlifting activity or a speed activity or a practice or whatever it is, because you're going to develop so much fatigue and so much tension in your system, you will tighten the system up. Naturally, that's what a muscle does is it gets tight. So it's going to become a little bit more contracted, and stretching that back out at the end of the exercise, at the end of the activity makes perfect sense. So at least you start the next day in a neutral position and you don't naturally kind of gravitate to being tighter and tighter and tighter.
Well, so many parents are watching their kids, and they watch them after school. They watch them on their tablets and phones, and they come in and they say, like, my kid's posture is a problem, because a lot of our youth kids' posture is an issue because they're spending time reading it on their phone.
Yeah.
And then they try and do sports, and they don't look good. And so a lot of well-meaning parents are saying, I told them that they got to do more stretching, and they won't do it. We've been trying to do this. I know that they need this. I know that they need this. And usually I would bias in this way, that the younger the person is, and the less likelihood of trauma and scar and horrible chronic posturing for 2 decades working at the factory. They haven't had that. They haven't even been alive for 2 decades. So if they don't have these deep wounds, they don't have a lot of chronic posturing for decades, then you fix the problem with dynamic motion. We got to give them, physical therapists need to give our youth a reasonable problem to solve that will look like a dynamic motion, and you do it 20, 30, 40, 50 times. And we can solve a lot of these back tensions, these forward neck issues, these awkward hip issues that they come across as tight. But we got to be careful that, if they're 15 in the middle of their growth phase, the system's going to be taught. Mm-hmm. I have seen over and over again where if I see the young person at 12 and they're able to do a backflip, and they're able to go into a deep campfire squat, and they look brilliant with all movement. And then I see him again at 15, and it's like, whoa, is this the same kid? Kid's now 6'2" and moves horrible.
Yeah.
The hip joint
lost
is
it all.
The joint has some stiffness. The fascial tone is there. Like, oh my gosh, you look horrible. But hey, patience. Let's just give them a dynamic solution to solve most days of the week prior to their sport. That will look like a scoop. That will look like a T. That will look like a long forward lunge. That'll look like a Bulgarian. That will look like a lateral lunge. That'll look like a Cossack. It is all these dynamic patterns and being patient. And after 1,000 reps of doing that and being patient with their growth, now we have an 18-year-old that moves insanely well. Yep. And that's if you're a boy, ramp that up 2 years if you're a girl. So that I've seen that truth over and over. And the well-meaning parent feels like their kid should spend all his time stretching. And really, they should be spending time trying to figure out the problem to solve with their new body.
You got to solve problems. Like the brain is designed to solve problems. So if it's posture, like on the top half, they're flexed forward more because it's just life, whether school, phone, whatever, homework. You said reading. I haven't seen that to be true. But if one was to actually read something, not on a phone, that would also be a problem, I suppose. But it's watching YouTube videos would probably fit into that category as well. Yeah, probably more likely the case at the moment. But
TikTok, Nick.
Yeah, if the problem is they're hunched over and it's forward and we have a postural issue, the problem to solve is, can you get tall? Can you get tall? Can you get vertical? Basically, can you get your hands over your head and function over your head in some way? Mm-hmm. So the extreme version and the Russ version would be to do a handstand.
I told the girl over the weekend, we were playing volleyball. She had the forward shoulder. Her mom's like, Russ, can you help that? I'm like, does she have any pain? No, she's perfectly healthy.
Do handstands.
Yeah. That's exactly
why wouldn't you?
Why? I mean, and she looked at me. I'm like, simple. I know. She goes, I think we can do that.
Yeah, because you solve the problem. Like you get weight overhead, and then you can't have bad posture in a handstand.
Yeah,
it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. You can't do it.
Yeah. So if you can't do a handstand, like most of us, then you would put your feet on the wall and work close to it. Try to get yourself as close to one as possible, or you can bring that back to like doing an overhead carry with a single arm kettlebell or dumbbell or something. You could do a double arm overhead carry. You see a lot of stuff. We do a lot of like overhead lunges, or like take a stick overhead and do a lunge or lunge and twist with the stick overhead. But you have to get the arms over the head. If the arms are over the head, you cannot have bad posture. Mm-hmm. Now, this doesn't work as good if you're 40 because you've been bad posture for 20 years, and now we do have this tissue that you have to change. So it goes back to the mobility stuff. And then you would do the handstand. Mm. But if you're like less than 18, you don't have trauma on your body. Russ, says to people all the time, you don't have any trauma on your body. Like you just need a stimulus to demand to change. But you don't have this history. If you have history of trauma on your body and you've got some scar tissue, you've got some bruises, you've got stiffness over time, you've had habits that have been ingrained for the better part of 10 or 20 years, reversing that is much, much more difficult. But in a young person, just give them the cue.
Yes.
In a healthy older person that doesn't have any pain, you can also probably give them the cue, but maybe in a less aggressive way, depending on how pliable their tissue is and how adaptable they are.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really kind of solves, going back to the beginning part of the conversation of stretching. Well, stretching for what? What's a goal? And to that, I think our body does have we might require different things of our body. And that is like, how much mobility do you need? I was helping with a prized fighter. He was a world champion, Cody Garbrandt, and he had severe back pain. And he traveled all over the world trying to get the fanciest injections that cost $100,000 every round to try and fix his back. And when I saw him, he had brutally tight hips. The front part of his hip and his thigh had all this collected tension. And then I would open up his groin, and it was also really tight. And then I'd watch him fight, and he would be able to like kick people in the head. And I'm thinking in my head, how are you doing that? Because you actually don't have the body that allows your leg to get up there and knock people out with a kick. But yet dynamically, with a lot of speed, he's able to do that. And that was interesting how with a lot of ballistic force, he can get his body to do things. But if I try and do it like slow, like no way could we get there. And I kind of described him as an overpowered athlete. He's using all of this speed and power to get into positions that his body cannot tolerate. He's constantly ripping his body apart. So even though he was only 29 at the time, we spent a fair amount of time stretching, but I would always couple like a long hold. Like I would hold it for 2-3 minutes before finally he'd be able to like, okay, I can finally breathe effectively.
Yes,
so
right.
I'd pry open his medial line and his anterior line slow, but then we would immediately do like a Cossack or a Bulgarian or some type of lateral lunge to then teach him how to use that length. We had to do that lesson like probably 30 or 40 times before it started sticking. And then he was able to do a training session, say, I don't have any back pain. And but that took a bit. That was a lot of lessons. If you do that 2 or 3 times a week, that was a lot.
Yeah.
But he required a lot of motion because that's what he wanted out of his body.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important feature to ask, well, how much motion do people need or want?
Yeah, I love that. I think that's, I want to talk about a couple of things. One of them being like, what do we see in athletes and like what's maybe a good balance? And then I think types of stretching would be valuable here as well. But with a guy like Cody, a couple of things. I know one of the things that gives Uriah like tremendous success and a lot of strength is that he actually, the way he's designed physiologically actually gives him advantages, right? Mm-hmm. His shoulders and neck ratio is quite short, right? His chin to his chest is actually quite low. So it's really hard to grab him, right? He's like really hard to grab his neck and get an arm, get underneath him and like put him in a headlock or anything like that, right? He's very difficult. And he's difficult to strike against because he's so compact and small that it's hard to get him cleanly like in the head or anything like that. Of course, you could attack his leg, which Aldo did brilliantly in his fight against him, but it's really tough. And then if you get him on the ground, it's hard to get him off you because of the way he's designed and he's shaped. So he uses that to his advantage. So him being a little tight and wound up is his advantage for his sport, right? One thing that I was always impressed about with basketball, and I learned this when I was at Arizona and around some of these elite athletes. I mean, these guys, most of them had long NBA careers. Guys like Jason Terry, Luke Walton, Richard Jefferson, guys who played 15, 20 years in the NBA. And I would, as we were doing this like team stretching, like my hamstring, my straight leg raise is like maybe 65 degrees on a good day, right? Which I learned later from Stu McMillan. He had this great line with Stu, who's a great speed coach. He's like, yeah, I'm not fast enough to hurt myself, so I don't end up with muscle strains. and I've also realized I have the same quality in my body, as I don't strain myself because I can't move fast enough or far enough to actually hurt myself. So it's a very safe place to live. But what I saw with these guys that were elite is their range of motion, their flexibility, if you will, combined with their uncanny strength, is what really makes the elite of the elite special. They didn't get there by stretching a lot. It's just they have the control, is what I would say. They have the motor control in their body and their system where they have, the body is made up of stabilizers and prime movers. So usually when you think of stretching, you're going to think of stretching prime movers. Your hamstring comes to mind, number 1, calf, number 2, pec, number 3, probably traps would be maybe number 4. These are the most common things we all think we need to stretch and feel the tightness in. Those are your prime movers. Those muscles move body parts. Whereas the stabilizer muscles, they hold things stable. So the prime movers can do their job. So you're set up with this kind of system. And I've seen it more and more. The more elite the athlete, the better that relationship is intact, where they have this unbelievable control and strength, and yet they have this unbelievable mobility that goes along with it. It's very, very rare. I saw it with Odell Beckham. I've seen it with you name it, Victor Cruz, with any guys down the list. that they have this unbelievable balance of flexibility with tremendous strength and power. Where you put them in a weight room, you put them underneath the squat rack, they produce tremendous amounts of force. And then you lay them on the table or you have them touch their toes and they move like fluidly. It's really, really incredible.
Ian Book is kind of like this too.
Yeah,
he's like really fluid, and a lot of strength and muscle that combines with that like fluidity of his like.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ian's very similar. Same way. Yeah. On the table, really quite flexible, hip wise, hamstring wise, all that stuff's there. But then you put them underneath the rack and you have them squat, you have them deadlift. Really, really powerful, explosive numbers, that are beyond the norm. And that balance of the two is really incredible. So that's a great thing to shoot for. And we see that, especially in multi-directional athletes, is great. But you should recognize that, like, say you're a runner. So say you're a distance runner, working with Kim Conley in the past, Kate Grace, some of the best, some of the two-time Olympians in the distance running events, and every other marathoner in the world. When you go ahead and do a straight leg raise on an athlete that does a lot of running, if it's better than 80, I'm actually concerned.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be tighter because their movement is so linear and so focused doing one-dimensional things. That's actually not a negative thing on a distance athlete. But if I took a sprinter who's running 100 meters and they're more of a power sport, I need to see that straight leg raise be much closer to 90 degrees plus because the nature of the mechanics they have to use are greater. So if you're out there marathon running and thinking, oh my God, I have to stretch my hamstrings all day long, they're so tight, that's normal for your event. You and all your friends have the same problem for a reason. And I would venture to say the person in your group who doesn't have that problem probably isn't as good or has pain somewhere. They might have back pain or foot pain, I bet you, because they're trying to do something and they have too much flexibility to do the task really, really well. So this works both ways. And it's very important, as we always talk about, what are we trying to do? What's the activity of the sport we're trying to be good at? And then what's the body type necessary to do that activity?
There's very few attributes about the human system, about any biological system, where more is better. If you think of it, just a single attribute, more is better. When does that ever work? You want the system to work well, not one attribute to work well. Right. More is not better. So when you think of flexibility, more is better? Nope. I'd say the same thing about strength. I'd say the same thing about power. Same thing. I mean, speed. Usain Bolt, retired not because he was number 2, number 1, over and over and over. Finally, he's like, "Hey, I'm done." Why do you think? Because his speed was ripping him apart.
Right. Look at Tiger. Same thing. And if we took somebody like Uriah, the point here is if we took a person like Uriah who was very successful with his fight career for so long because of maybe the way he was designed. You said this about Chad Mendez as well. The way Chad's designed is just like he's very difficult to beat. If we had made them more flexible, if you had, say, elongated his neck, you probably would have made him like 80% more vulnerable.
Yeah.
Because now all of a sudden he has a weakness that can be attacked, even though it would have made him a better athlete as a whole. And maybe a healthier, long-term big vision of life. But in that sport with that skill set, that tactic, that wouldn't have done him a service. So you have to be careful of that we're not trying to make everybody the same. That's a huge component. What do you have genetically? What are you trying to do? And then, is that the right equation is a whole nother talk. But if you're trying to get the best you can, consider what it is you're after, and not everybody needs to have this flexibility.
Well, I've said it before, and I love talking like this. Right around the time of Jesus Christ, back in like 0 AD, there was also an architect by the name of Vitruvius. And Vitruvius was obsessed with ratios, and he built structures that had this beauty. His beauty of a structure was based off of the ratios of height, length, and width, and the curve. And he was really obsessed with that because he also found that strength was in key ratios. And then fast forward 1,500 years, we have Leonardo da Vinci. He drew the Vitruvian Man. And the Vitruvian Man is that image. Everyone knows that image. It's it's the naked man that's spread out, like his arms out to the side, his legs out to the side, one foot's turned up. And
there's a circle around him with like a triangle.
Yep. And it's the image is also an image of ratios, and it's called the Vitruvian Man because it's referring back to that architect 1,500 years earlier. And it's a game of ratios where the head and the hand and the limb length are all to a set parameter based off of the whole. And so what I love about that is when it comes to flexibility, any attribute, it has to be put together with the rest of the body. And so if you could think of a game of ratios, it's just everything is relative to something else in the system. And the system has to work in a cohesive way. So if you have a fair amount of mobility, but you lack strength in that long position, you get hurt a lot. And if you have excessive strength, but you use it on a very confined position, you get hurt a lot. And if you have a lot of power, but poor stamina in certain tissues, you get hurt a lot. So when you have this imbalance of the different attributes of our performing system, you tend to get hurt. The system gets abused in one way. And so there is this balance that's really motivated by what do you want to do with your body? Your body is an incredible adaptive, a biological machine that can do all these crazy things, but you kind of have to have first a desire to do it. And then do you have a bit of the DNA that allows you to do that effectively? And then do you have a system that works together? And I think that mindset does take a lot of thought. Now the best athletes don't think at all. They just do. And we kind of like, academics or PTs or sports med people, we look on the side and marvel at their ability to do it. But when they get injured and something is off and a pain pattern is present, we then have to say, how is the system inefficient with itself? We have to reference itself and not say, well, I stretched someone else's hamstrings, so I know if it's going to fix your back pain. We're all relative to really how we are put together. It's super unique. That's what's so fun about this whole thing.
Yeah, it's fun and super challenging. I had a kid, the high school football player, and he also does the pole vault. Really, really fast kid, the fastest kid in the school, and the 100 meters. His pole vault's very good as well, and then he's a phenomenal athlete on the football field as well, the fastest kid on the team. So he was having trouble this season, like in the fall, like kind of 2 or 3 games in, he was starting to have a little bit of hamstring stuff, and he had a spondy on his spine like a year prior, right? So we worked through that, got everything strong, dialed everything in, got him on a good program. But because of that spondy, he was hesitant to like lift pretty heavy, certainly into the late spring and into the summertime of the football team. So he'd kind of done some, but really not pushed it that hard. And then as we get into the football season, he started to have some hamstring stuff come back around. His mobility is outstanding, like straight leg raises 90 degrees. His girth of his like thighs and muscles is really well developed. And his speed and power is like really impressive, like unmatched. Yeah. So he's very difficult to bring down like in a kick return situation or as a receiver because he's so shifty and just really, really explosive. And so when you look at that balance of like, all right, here's an athlete who's really explosive, also quite flexible. And the question is, why is he having a hamstring problem? What are we doing? The big question is, are we doing too much? So the football coach, everybody thought, parents thought, man, is he doing too much? Are we pushing him too hard? Everybody says we're pushing him too hard. And so we talked a lot about like, well, let's talk about what you've been doing over the last 3 months. And I knew the kid pretty well and the dad really well, and they're great people and really dedicated to helping him be healthy and do the right thing. So we'd worked through his back together. So we kind of revisited, what did you do? How'd it go as you went into the summer with the football team and such? And he's like, well, we lifted, but like we took it kind of easy. We didn't push him too hard because of his back. And we just didn't want to flare it up and wanted to go into the season healthy, And as we had those conversations and I evaluated him further and we just kind of go through it, I'm like, I'm not seeing anything here mechanically that jumps out off the table. The only parameter that I'm seeing is that I don't think you're strong enough relative to the amount of power you can generate. Mm-hmm. Like, you're freakishly fast and freakishly shifty. And you just told me you didn't strength train hard for the last 6 to 9 months. Mm-hmm. And it is possible that you're actually too fast for what your tissue is able to tolerate.
Overpowered. You're
overpowered. And at your age, maybe that's a bit rare, but we went through like the ideas of overuse. He's like, he's only practicing like for an hour and a half a day, and it's really not even hard for him. Like he doesn't come home tired. Mm-hmm. He's not losing. None of the overtraining signs were there. Mm-hmm. I'm like, I think you're undertrained. Mm-hmm. Like I think we need to get back. Let's get back in the weight room, which I usually would not recommend mid-season, but I'm like, being in the state we're in and where we're at in this, let's get you strong. Yeah. So his real passion is pole vaulting. So it was like, well, I wouldn't lift heavy during football season, but it is what it is, and you're already weak, so do something a couple of days a week, Yeah. So he's like, practice is not difficult, and I'm like, all right, well then let's lift a little bit. So we added like a couple of days, 2 days, like kind of decent lifts to work on his strength, hypertrophy work, and then as he got the season kind of wound down, it really hit it hard for a month, but his hamstring problems went away, and then he's had a great start to the season so far with his sprint work and with his pole vaulting stuff. It's brilliant, but it's interesting, like. The normal practice would have been everyone is telling me you're doing too much.
Yes.
You're running too much. And then let's just do some massage and soft tissue.
Yes.
And let's continue to stretch the hamstrings. Clearly it's a hamstring problem. It's, we need to work on it. We need to help it heal. It's like, well, the mechanics for that was that it actually wasn't strong enough in the first place.
Man, you just hit on something that I've not seen in research. I've pressured AI to do my lit reviews, which is how I operate. Do lit review for me. Why don't you do some deep thinking? Show me what research is. And this research is not there. And the research is going back to DSI, your dynamic strength index. And I like the old term better, the dynamic strength deficit. So is there a deficit between your power and your strength? Philosophically, I love it. I mean, because it completely is trying to capture the overpowered athlete, trying to identify, hey, you are overpowered because I can measure your power here. So let's call it 3,000 newtons with a jump. And then when I look at your strength, like, you're only creating whatever it is, maybe you're creating only 2,500 newtons. You're able to create more strength ballistically than you can with slow tension. And usually we see the slow tension surpassing what you can dynamically. And for a super overpowered athlete, like it's inverted.
Yep.
So say his strength is 2,000 newtons and his power is 3,000 newtons. Then we have the clear definition of overpowered. You're able to create all this force only ballistically. And if you do it slow, you don't have that ability. And I think that is our overpowered athlete. I think that they have these injury risks where they rip their body apart. And I think that's more often than we think. But right now, I don't think there's any clear research. I think DSI is a very poorly defined thing in literature. Very poor. I'm extremely upset academically about that.
Why don't you dive a little deeper into that, Russ? And I have a few.
Yep. So here's my soapbox. I'll get it on real quick. So the DSI was originally measured as an isometric mid-thigh pull. So you put the barbell right at your mid-thigh and you push in the force platform and you do an isometric force in that high pull position. Okay. Then you take a jump. You take someone's jump and you look at their peak propulsive force amidst a counter movement jump, and you compare those two numbers in time. I think a momentary number, I'm not in love with that, and I'm not in love with the various positions. Your peak position in a jump might be at the lowest position. Might be. Sometimes it might be in the mid jump. And then why the isometric mid-thigh pull? Why this position? And I'll tell you why.
Why did we choose these two movements?
We chose the isometric mid-thigh pull because it is where you pull the barbell and you have to jerk it to do any kind of power clean, hang clean, jerk. It's all the Olympic lifting progressions. So people defined the DSI, the dynamic strength index, I think, purely for barbell programming. That's starting to make sense.
Well, barbell programming people designed the DSI.
Yes. Barbell Olympic lifting programming people designed the DSI, and then it allowed them to deliver, this person's overpowered, underpowered, and then they programmed the Olympic lifting person, which is typically in college because you don't Olympic lift 15-year-olds that often. So these are typically well-seasoned, well-trained athletes that are in the college weight room. And so I think it took a phenomenal idea and it created a very niche way of measuring it that's very overly focused, and then it loses interest to me. So the reason why I don't like it is I think that it captures a number in a moment in time. It's trying to find the right ratio, but the philosophy is brilliant. I just don't think it's applied well. And as an example, most women have a weaker grip than men relative to their body weight. It has to do with how much muscle you have in your hand, how heavy is your hand, and how heavy is your shoulder. So for the same weight, female to male, the male is usually going to have more muscle on their shoulder and more muscle through their arm, and they're going to deliver a harder strength. Now, that's not every person, but on average, yes. So the whole DSI concept, the numbers should not apply to both sexes given that anatomical variation in boys and girls. And so I don't like that. I also don't like that the isometric mid-thigh pull is a skilled movement. It's an isometric exercise that you kind of have to be good at. And if you just did a little bit of training, you actually get better at it, but a lot of it is your back strength and your grip strength, and it's trying to capture a lower body quantity of power. So I love to revert back to that long soapbox. I almost just bored myself there. So what I'd say is I love the philosophy of a dynamic strength index, which I think should go back to the original name of a dynamic strength deficit between your slow strength and your fast strength. I love the philosophy, and I do not think that we hit it very well mathematically of actually capturing it. I don't think we're capturing it at all. And I think we're probably going to get closer if we look at the area under the curve, which in the jump world, that's called an impulse. So I think we can get a little bit clever with how we capture power. Is it just peak propulsive power, which is really like basic, or is it some attribute of force over time? And we have smarter people in the company that are diving into this. I'm going to call out Nico and Jonathan right now. You guys need to solve this riddle. But I love the philosophy of an overpowered athlete. I think an overpowered athlete is more at risk of these weird injuries, and it can be brutal. It can be fractures and disc injuries and hamstring tears and all the like. So it is a big deal. And for us to define these, I think it's really important. And academically, they have not done that yet.
Yeah, I think, well, that's where the screening process comes in, is to be able to screen to see that if we have the right screening techniques, the right screening process, we can identify an overpowered person and then help them reduce risk by giving them the right strength pieces. But yeah, I think that piece on DSI is always good about, when we get things set up, and this has been going on, certainly the last 5 years has been really big on the force plate movement, and this is kind of where we're at right now. And it does seem that there's the DSI. If you do Olympic lifting, it makes a ton of sense to do a DSI with a mid thigh pull and then a counter movement jump. But if you don't, to Russ's point, and your grip strength could be a limiting factor, or you're not good at that second pull of the deadlift, there are things that we could probably look at that would be better. Then that's the argued point, and that we believe that there's some things that could be better. We use a belt squat as another opportunity there, where it's really hard to mess that up. It's something that's pretty easy, takes the arms out of the equation, loads up the hips, and really allows people to drive without having to think twice about the situation. So it's a good alternative, we feel like, and have moved in that direction in many categories. But I think the one thing you brought, the Vitruvian Man, I think the idea of ratios is something that we've played around much, much more with. And I think this is a really, really important point as we talk about so many things we try to talk about in absolutes, like how strong should somebody be, what range of motion is good, is a squat good, is a sprint mechanics good, all those things. And we talk about it in absolutes, but it shouldn't be really described in absolutes. It's very important to describe it in more of relativity. Are they moving well relative to something else in their body, like to their body as a whole, to their weight that they have, to the flexibility that they have, to the strength that they have? So I think this is going to be a bigger thing. The more we dive into trying to identify what the ratios are, I think the more successful we're going to be as a profession, and as we in training folks as well as rehabilitating folks, looking more for that than this idea of absolutes. And we've talked about it forever. There's been ratios that have been really popular in life, like, what's your quad to hamstring ratio? I mean, that's something that's been around for ages that has never really faltered, and people have stuck with that for the test of time. But we have some other challenges that I think are going to, you've dove into a lot of ideas. I love the idea. We're doing this with some of our tactical operators, this idea of, all right, how much weight can you pull, whether you do a belt squat or a mid-thigh pull or a deadlift, how much weight can you pull relative to how strong is your core? What is the flexion side? What does the front side of the body do compared to what does the back side of the body do?
Yeah, I love this. It's so cool, because I love telling people who are big, strong firefighters, fighters, or strength athletes in the gym, and I like saying, your stomach sucks. And they're like, what? I'm like, well, you're able to pull 500 from the ground, but you can only do that for 80 pounds. That sucks. That's my definition of sucks. And they're like, oh, really? And that's, I think, the coolest thing is I get to have, now we kind of made up this framework.
Well, because we think there's a correlation. Everybody in the world is like, oh, deadlifting is bad for your back. I don't believe that's necessarily true.
Yeah.
And I'm not so sure that back squatting is bad for your back. But it could be if you don't have the front side to counter it. Is the argument that we're making.
Yes.
And so how do you measure that? It becomes the fun question to answer. Because if we could measure it consistently and effectively, then you counter that with how strong the lift is. And then now again you have a ratio of front side strength to back side strength, and I think there's something there.
And I think this spawns out into other conversations in a hurry. I remember 9th grade, Coach Patolny at Jesuit. He said, you don't have to do a single ab exercise in PE if you could do one standing ab wheel. So of course I was in numbskull to try it first. I did it, completely strained my abs. I couldn't laugh for like 2 weeks from trying to do a standing ab wheel. And it blew my mind how hard that was. And I tried for all year to do it. And I never got to it that year. It took me decades later to get it. But I never got it. But I appreciated that's like, hey, this is how strong I want you to be. And if you're not that strong, then you're going to be doing drills to get that strength. And
what's the name of that push-up? It's a push-up in karate where they put their hands over their head. And
I don't know.
Kaizen or something like that?
I don't know. I don't know the name of it.
In karate, there's a push-up where you put your hands over your head like you're doing like in a diamond position.
Brutal. Yeah,
and you try to do it. The push-up is fingertips above your head and your toes, and you just gotta lift.
The degree of tension. Same concept. It's the same concept.
Yeah, so it's like, can you create the kind of tension in the front line? That would be just as good of a test with your own body weight compared to how much weight you can squat with. If you can't do the front one, the back one may become a problem. Not because the motion's wrong, but because your ratio is out of alignment.
Well, we had one athlete, he was able to do it, and he became a world-class wrestler for Princeton, actually. But he weighed 125 pounds. And so he was really, really small guy. And sometimes you can look at these like very small, tight-framed wrestlers, like a Uriah, and they can operate their body very, very effectively because they have a short lever. And so you could say like, well, he was stronger relative to him than I was. Yes, he was relative to him. And there I look back at look at your NBA guys that are 6'8". These levers are so long that oftentimes I think they get hurt because they're unable to control that length. Mm-hmm. And so this is where when we think of like a back squat or a dead or a front squat or a power clean or a split squat, when it's healthy or it's not healthy, we kind of have to look at the body and how well are they able to make these shapes under control. It's not all tall people can't squat. Not all tall people can't deadlift effectively. It's really a game of ratios. Where do they have their weight? Is their weight, and that goes back to the shape idea. So now we have length is a component of the game because that sets the lever. But then where do you hold your mass, or do you have fat? Hopefully not too much fat. But where do you hold the muscle? Is it center? Is it up high? Is it down low? Or is it evenly distributed? And I think all these factors kind of give us pros and cons of what shapes we're able to make with ease. And therein lies what comes naturally and where we should be spending most of our time training, because whatever comes easy, you can make that a little bit better, but you probably got to fill the limiting factor if you're a long femur person or if you're a long trunk person. And that might equate to maybe you do have to put more energy in your stomach because of how you're built. But the ratios, I think, are there, but it's a limb length game. And it's also where is your muscle mass, because that means where are you holding your fluid. We have all these crazy things at play that make it that as the older I get and the more I learn, the more questions I have. And that's really where it really F's up the whole curiosity thing, because you start asking too many questions. You're like, oh, now we're back to ground one. Well, what do you want to do with your body?
The more you know, the more you realize you don't know, right? So let's regroup back onto some of the things we talked about with stretching and mobility, because I think that's people are really interested in, if they do stretch, how much, and then that stuff. So if you do find that you go to stretch and the tricks that I shared with you didn't work, then that means you probably do have some tissue length limitations, and you might want to work on that, which would be a great idea. So there's different ways to do so. The rule of thumb, if you're going to do a static stretch and a long hold, the science here suggests that 90 seconds is how long it takes for this fascial tissue and for this muscle tissue to truly relax to be able to elongate, is a 90-second hold. This is why you see this in yoga and some other these movement strategies where they're very long, prolonged hold positions, is that those are ancient strategies, and it turns out the science actually backs that the average is about 90 seconds. So some people might be better in 30 seconds of stretching. Some people might take 3 minutes of stretching, but it's somewhere around 90 seconds is the average. You got to figure out where you're at and what works best for you. That's called a static stretch, where you stretch and then you hold the position. As Russ indicated earlier, if you do that, we would encourage you to then use that range of motion immediately following as best as you can. So if it's doing a straight leg stretch to stretch your toes, maybe following that up with a lunge or an RDL type of a motion, not a heavy one, but just go through the motion of an RDL or a light kettlebell swing, so that you use the motion you just gained in a strength way. That will make it valuable so that your brain will actually retain the new motion you gained. It's a very much a use it or lose it game. So if you stretch and then you go sit, within a few minutes, you go right back to where you were. But if you stretch and then you go use it constructively, well, then you actually could keep a good portion of what you gained, hopefully. And that might take a few reps and, weeks of repeating to actually get to that point, but that's certainly a way to go. There's also a stretching technique, like Russ mentioned ballistic things a few times, like with Cody doing the kicking motions. Ballistic stretching means that you can kind of go in and out of the range of motion in a relatively rapid way. So instead of like holding a position a long period of time, you actually go into it quickly and back out of it. And you can do this with like a band or a strap or like a bungee of some kind, where you pull it in and then let it go back, pull it in, let it go back. And you try to get in and out of these increased zones almost rapidly. It looks like you're trying to cheat the motion. Mm-hmm. But there is benefit to this. It's the least valuable of the stretching techniques as far as to gain range of motion, but it does exist. It's been not used a long time. It's probably more in line with warm-up or pre-activity stuff to just get things moving, mobilize tissue, but you're probably not going to truly like lengthen the tissue all that much. You're just going to kind of cheat your way through it typically. But it can be good to activate the tendons, activate some length-tension relationships. So that's another strategy that's out there, but usually probably used to be used as an alternative stretching option by the Russians, but it's now probably better positioned like pre-exercise situation. And then the other one is what people call PNF stretching, which is it's a version of PNF. It's called contract relax, which is what most people will use this for, is you'll stretch the muscle into a certain position, like say you're on your back, but you stretch your hamstring, and then you make a contraction into the zone. So you'd push back against the resistance for 7 seconds is the dedicated science-proven time. And then you relax and then take up the slack and stretch it again. And you repeat this until you stop making gains. So you put the tissue on stretch, have it contract back, 7-second hold, relax, stretch a little bit further, repeat, and you keep repeating this until you've used up all of the motion that you can acquire in a 1 to 2 minute period. That's actually been shown to give you the fastest benefits, and you end up with about the same benefit as you get from the static stretching. So either one of those two is effective. Both tend to give benefits for the same period of time, whether it be and it's about a day, is what the science shows, is that if you test them, you stretch them, PNF or static, measure them again at 24 hours, measure them again at 48 hours, they tend to kind of diminish back to the norm, back to the standard at about the same rate. But if you use it during that period of time, you can extend that window much longer. And the idea would be that as long as you keep moving and keep using it, then you don't lose it again as much. So those are your common strategies that we see every day. Fielder's choice. The big thing is, what does your body respond well to? Does it respond well to hold stretches? Does it respond well to PNF stretching? What is it? What is it like to use?
Yeah, and you need a goal. If you're going to open up your body, hopefully you're using it effectively to use that length, which I'd hope everyone does. But you also need a goal of hey, I want to get to here. Whatever the movement is, and if you don't know that goal, then you could ask the internet, or you could ask your favorite physical therapist. We tend to have those benchmarks pretty well dialed.
Absolutely. Well, if you guys have some stretching secrets or things that have been great for you, please share them in the comments below. We'd love to kind of hear your stories and what's worked for you and what things you're doing. I'll add that biggest questions we get is do I stretch more? Should I foam roll? Should I use the vibration guns? Those are super common. Everybody's got one now and everybody's doing something with it. So typically using vibration, if you use it for a short period of time, is going to cause the muscle to be more contracted and be tighter. If you use it for a prolonged period of time, greater than 30 seconds or so, then you actually can get a relaxation effect. So if you're just moving the gun around your body and you're not really holding it in a certain area for very long, you're going to get a lot of activation, and it's a great pre-workout tool. If you're using it for relaxation, you would have to hold it in the same spot for a prolonged period of time to get that benefit, but I would argue that it's not your best option. The best option would be to do a foam roll, hold pressure, long period of time. Get it to hold it, long period of time, then stretch. So foam roll, then stretch, either PNF or static, doesn't matter, would be your best recipe if you're trying to really gain motion in a tissue. So use a pressure point, whether it be a foam roller or a ball or something, and then stretch it following with either PNF or static to actually truly gain motion, and then use it. So roll it, stretch it, and then use it would be your recipe. But I hope this helps you guys out and gives you some things you can utilize. We'll look forward to talking to you next time. We'll see you.